Hey everyone, thanks for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers. Asking for your help tonight because even though we have record numbers of subscribers here on Reluctant Preppers trying to spread the word about preparedness and self-reliance and awareness, we've been receiving reduced revenue from our YouTube videos being marked as advertiser unfriendly and having to curtail the content and the descriptions and the topics and the guests that we can introduce. So with your help, we can overcome that and break free of that restriction. If you go to patreon.com/reluctantpreppers, you can make any amount of small or modest or larger monthly donation to help support our mission. We've established goals there to help bring you even more content with the different levels that we can achieve together. Thanks, folks. Check it out, patreon.com/reluctantpreppers. And now, on to our main event.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We're privileged to have a returning guest tonight, Cristian, founder of The Last American Vagabond, a piercing critic on the American political and financial and military scene and risks associated with loss of liberty, is here with us again on Reluctant Preppers. Ryan, thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Johnny. Thanks for having me.
I was hoping that you could join us in a rational analysis of whether or not the world as we know it and the current financial and power structures that support us can continue for another generation. We get a lot of criticism as preparedness-minded people from people with a very strong normalcy bias that talk about we're just Chicken Little saying the sky is falling and running around doom and gloom and not living our lives and not enjoying the beauty of the world, and why don't we just kind of lighten up and quit crying wolf all the time. Been saying the same thing for 7 years in a row now or 10 years in a row now, and it hasn't happened yet kind of thing. So with your help, I'd like to see if we can examine what, from your perspective, are some of the key and critical scenarios that are the most credible that we believe are likely to play out over, so just for the sake of discussion, let's just take the next 2 decades, the next 20 years, which is roughly a generation, and the backdrop of that being the baby boomer retirement and geopolitical tensions around the world right now, and sort of this runaway sovereign debt of all nations being on fiat, and we can hit on each of those. But if there's others you want to tie into that, maybe you can kick us off with the geopolitical collisions between nations. What does that have to do with U.S. foreign policy? What's really the motivation and the driving factor behind that? And can that go on as it is, or as it has been, for another 20 years without a major flare-up that's going to have repercussions in all those other areas?
I would say absolutely not, but the first thing that came to mind in your opening there was the idea that the one thing we fail to consider is that, just for instance, just take the United States government, that they are actively trying to keep these things from happening, or keep us from noticing that they're happening, right? And so I feel like that plays a huge factor. But obviously, I would say the major goal, there are many of them, but behind, maybe you're alluding to the creation of these geopolitical problems, whether the North Korea or China or Russia, is money, I would say, or rather the creation of the funding for the military-industrial complex, the creation of, the maintaining of the petrodollar. But I would say that it's a pretty clear answer that most likely within 20 years or a lot less, we're going to see major changes. And I think the idea that, let's just say, take the idea of people claiming that the dollar is going to fall or collapse, which is kind of what you were saying in the beginning, that it's like, oh, we're always claiming the sky is falling. Like it's all, right. Next year this is going to happen, and it never seems to happen. But that's, first of all, because they're actively trying to manipulate the system to make it seem like it's not happening, but also that they're doing everything they can to keep it back. But at the same time, I think it's pretty clear that what we're doing as a country, financially specifically, is 100% not sustainable. And every economic person, regardless of how wrong they typically are agreeing with that. And basically what we're doing is we're borrowing more money than spending that borrowed money and pretending that shows some kind of growth in our country. And I think an elementary school kid could see that difference, but yet we all buy into it going forward,
You mentioned, and you've written pretty extensively on this recently on your blogs and video blogs, about the apparent policy of unending conflict around the world. If you could touch on that, what evidence do we see that there's policy of creating unending conflict, basically smoldering global war all the time. But how long can that smoldering continue? Is that something that can be sustained, or is that something that you see most likely will cause a risk of a major blow up?
That's a good question, because I feel like the answer is clearly that they want to maintain this, but at the same time, obviously, it's not sustainable if you're going to be going and overthrowing and bombing countries into nothing. So clearly that they have a specific agenda that's dictating which countries they choose to do what they're doing to, their forceful practice of democracy and freedom, if that's what you want to call it. But clearly, I mean, you could go all the way back to the 7 countries in 5 years plan, which General Wesley Clark had talked about, that we're clearly out to overthrow these specific countries. And there's a lot of different reasons for why we're trying to do that, whether that be oil or the pipelines, or you could go to the central bank route with the Rothschild family and how that works out. But at the end of the day, I think clearly that they want to maintain this for the purposes of the bloated budget for the military-industrial complex. And really, in most of these countries that you find that we're involved with do tend to have a lot of oil. I mean, Golan Heights in Syria is the current example. And we have people like Dick Cheney and the Rothschilds and these families that are illegally with Israel, essentially mining oil out of a sovereign nation right now. And it's happening right now. But yet we're constantly fighting over the territory of Syria specifically to lay this pipeline that's been laid out for decades. And so, I mean, the point being with the question you asked was that, yes, I think that we're going to maintain this facade of spreading freedom to the specific countries we wish, to maintain this idea of this phantom terrorism threat and, whatever excuse we throw out there to maintain it.
The other topic we haven't touched on is the demographic bubble that's been growing because of the baby boomer generation entering retirement and also entering their elder years, where over the next couple of decades they're going to be needing more medical care than they have in their entire life up till now. And we've also seen at the same time the cost of medical care and the types of treatment through, whether it's expensive prescription drugs or expensive new high-tech procedures, and a lot of the buildup of systems around that in terms of hospitals and the management of that whole practice seems to be another. You touched on military-industrial complex. We got this medical-industrial complex that's like a beast that needs to be fed. But there's also a lot of these pension plans, whether it's private pension plans on the part of corporations that are invested in the backside, either in things that aren't making fixed interest at any rate anymore, or they're highly leveraged into the stock market, which is being pumped up by the Fed, et cetera. So with the retirement bubble, the demographic bubble of the baby boomer generation going off of the work rolls and onto the retirement rolls and into the medical system, will our current pension and medical retirement system hold over the next 20 years? Will it fail, and what happens if it does?
Yeah, that's one thing that I think people fail to really pay attention to is that the medical aspect. And it's interesting you put it that way, the medical industrial complex, because that's very much what it is. On a side note, I just read an interesting article from John Rappaport who asked the question, why has there never been a medical Edward Snowden? And goes on to make that point you just made, that this is one of the most secretive complexes of our country right now, the medical complex. And it's absolutely not sustainable. And I think that's one of the most obvious not sustainable aspects of this country. I mean, everything we're doing to ourselves is we're becoming more sick and more dependent. And yet the ridiculous hypocrisy, or rather the irony there, is that we're becoming more dependent on a system that's very quickly going to no longer be there. And I think that's just simple math. I mean, they will, like I said, they're going to do everything they can to, patch up the bullet hole with Band-Aids and whatever they can to make it appear and stretch it out a little bit further. But the bottom line is that as our population grows, there's not going to be enough money coming in to sustain the more people that are going to be sucking from the system. And, in a way, I think it's kind of designed like that. But I mean, but then the flip side is that our medical system is making us more sick. And I think that is such a glaring hypocrisy in our system right now that I think it's medical treatment is the third or second leading cause of death in this country. And, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the medical system is destined to fail. And it's really just a matter of time until we just watch it collapse. And I think that they're going to I feel what I would say to all these problems, getting a little ahead of myself, is rather that everything that we're doing right now is going to be set up to be the finger to point at, or the scapegoat, if you will. They were going to say, yep, look at whatever Donald Trump did and whatever the actions we're taking now is why everything fell apart. That's kind of what I think is going to play out. But that's why we're seeing this fire stoked all the way till the end.
One of the things we didn't touch on sufficiently there was about retirement. We have both private pension plans and Social Security, and both of those are facing sort of a demographic cliff as well, with the contributors dropping rapidly, and people that need to draw out of it increasing exponentially over the next decade to 2 decades. So what happens to a society where the entitlement that was supposed to be provided, it can't, it fails itself? I mean, we certainly can look back, 80 years now from the Great Depression, and see what happened then. But that was at a time when 90% of the people in the country lived on farms, and even though there was some weather disasters around that same time, most people at least had the knowledge and the wisdom on how to raise their own food. So what happens now that our populations are crowded into urban areas and have lost that knowledge on how to feed themselves when the systems, the entitlements go away?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's Agenda 21 in action right there. And I would say the answer is obvious. I mean, we're going to see, we're going to see a problem. We're going to see a collapse of general societal norms. I mean, it's the classic idea. You're going to go turn the water faucet on and there won't be water. You're going to go buy some milk and there won't be any at the store. But I would rather pose the question that is that intentional? The idea that we've been created and cultivated into this need to live in these concrete jungles and losing our understanding of how to actually survive without those things. And then yet it's almost like we can see that cliff ahead of us. I would argue that that's possibly even the time, like we're looking at the drop, that once these things implode by design, possibly that's the design that because I maybe this is kind of, I can feel this leaning towards the idea of eugenics. And that's something that may be able to stretch for some people, but it's a very realistic and openly discussed topic. People like Bill Gates openly talk about the idea that we need to find ways to cull the population. And in a way, he's right, but I disagree with where he's going with that. No one has the right to kill anybody else for the success of anything. But the point is that we're going to get to a point, just like we're talking about, where the sheer numbers of our population are going to make it so we can no longer do the things we've been doing. But that doesn't mean we should go out killing people. But I would argue that that's possibly why this is happening. This is a system that's been set up to fail. We've been made deliberately more sick to bog down the system to get to a point to where people will no longer be able to take care of themselves through the system, and they no longer have the skills needed to survive outside of the system. And there you go. And there's their solution. But that's all hypothetical, but it sounds plausible to me.
Well, you made me think about the next major topic when you were talking about a system designed to fail with the fiat currency system, and we've had numerous guests on our show from various walks of life. Jerry Robinson, author of Bankruptcy of Our Nation. We've had Jeff Clark from goldsilver.com and others who have been on talking about the inherent sort of end game that happens in a debt-based, where the system has to grow in order to survive, but by growing it always demands more currency be created than can possibly pay back the debt that you already, because there's interest that can't be paid back, that sort of thing. Now that, and we've also been told, like Andy Hoffman from Miles Franklin talked on here about how never in the history of the world have we had every country having a sovereign debt based on having its currency based on nothing being other than debt itself, so that it isn't just a U.S. problem, it's a global problem across all nations having runaway debt. And in what we're seeing in the U.S. is, like with every presidency, a doubling of the national debt to previously unthinkable levels, that the interest on that, servicing that debt, can only be swept under the rug because of artificial zero interest policies from the Fed, but that depends on the confidence of buyers showing up to buy the bonds, and anything that's going to shake the confidence in the bond buyers, in the people who will no longer want to buy treasuries, would force, and this is what Gregory Mannarino has been on to talk about, would force the true interest rates to break out and take off and to kind of re-snap back to reality and come out of this trance that they've been forced under by Fed policy. And then you end up with this huge monster you've let in, and now he wants to be fed, because this huge debt, which everybody said has been yawning at because it hasn't needed feeding, because it's been doubling and doubling and doubling under zero interest or low interest policies. But now suddenly you've got this high interest, and you can't. It would consume all of your, or a huge portion of your annual budgets just to serve the debt, and then all of your entitlement programs, all your social supporting programs to feed this helpless populace that we were just talking about get curtailed, and then is it riots in the streets and martial law, or what? How do you see that scenario? How realistic do you believe that scenario to be? What do you think? What's the most realistic scenario? Do you think we can sustain that for the next generation, or the next 20 years?
Absolutely not. And I think that anybody, I'm not an economics expert either, but anybody that you could pretty much reach out to anybody that's in economics today, and they will tell you, bottom line, that what we're looking at right now is just it's a matter of when, not if. And most of them are actually recommending today that we make it happen. That it's better that we have a collapse under our own terms than have it happen without us being in control of it to a certain degree.
Kind of lance the boil before it takes your leg, before it spreads.
Yeah, that's pretty alarming when you think about it. That they're actually advocating for us to collapse the system to us inside of a certain controlled degree, and that's pretty alarming. But that should show you right there. I mean, the way you explained it just now was excellent, and it shows you pretty clearly that it's a system that would have failed if left to its own devices. That we have been actively keeping it from falling apart. It's designed to fail at this point. Whether it was set up in the beginning to fail, we've known for a long time that it's catastrophic. It's leading that way. We saw it in 2008, and we never learned our mistakes. And it's happening the same thing right now with our auto loans. It's like the example you used right there was perfect. Like the rubber band, it's going to snap back. We continue to pull it, it snaps back, and eventually it's going to break. I mean, and that's just the bottom line. So right now we're leading up into it, trying to hide it from everybody, but we're all on the same page. I mean, it's going to eventually reach a point where it breaks. And then the question you posed was, or rather the after that is, what do we do? And I would say that is part of what we're trying to accomplish from like a deep state, larger level. You get to the central banks and the way that's, I mean, look at, like you talked about with the debt. Where is this debt going to? There are people behind the scenes that control this stuff. There are people behind the scenes that this debt's belonging to, these central banks. And that's the kind of people we would associate with the deep state, New World Order. I know those words are hard for some people to really wrap their mind around, very conspiratorial, but they're very real things, and they're openly talked about. And I would say that that's the plan, that we pushed out this nationalistic person, even though that's not really what he's doing. He's right in line with the globalists from before him, but his policy, his verbiage is all about national, America first. And the idea, I think, is that we're pushing that idea up until the point when we see the system collapse, which I would argue is going to happen under Donald Trump. And then that's their scapegoat. They say, see, nationalism doesn't work. We need globalism. We need to come under one flag and make sure that we don't let this happen again. And that's nothing new. I mean, people have spoken out about that, but I would say that's the most logical next step to what we're seeing after the collapse of the dollar, which is going to happen soon, in my opinion.
So where do you believe people who are concerned about that can actually take actions? What actions do you think are the most meaningful that people can take now to protect their vital interests?
Well, I mean, the obvious thing that people throw out is to get, sound money, gold, silver. But, that always, to most people today, that comes across as some kind of a sales pitch. Like we're trying, after we say that, look at the link at the bottom. That's not really what right. It is a smart move to get some gold and silver. Mm-hmm. But I would advocate more than just that. I mean, it's not even about money at that point. You're going to need once the dollar collapses, there's still going to be money and transactions happening. But for me, it makes more sense to understand how trade works in that type of world. And you need to focus on the skills we talked about, knowing how to, permaculture, learning how to farm and do things for yourself. And then once you produce food and products and things like that you can sustain yourself with, that's where the real money is. In a society where the dollar no longer exists, being able to trade goods and services is much more valuable. And that's where I would say the most import should be.
Do you believe that someone who's living in an urban environment right now, that it's credible that they can survive a catastrophic collapse of the system?
Depends on what you mean. You mean just like a financial collapse?
I guess the scenarios we're talking about certainly could include a financial collapse. I think we were also talking about loss of social order, loss of normal functioning of society.
Absolutely, though. I would say those are the exact people that would have the best chance of surviving something like that. The ones that are their entire life system is plugged into the state and are living inside of a small concrete box. And, within 10 feet of 100 other people, it's clearly that's going to be a chaotic situation. Whereas somebody who's living in the middle of the country with their own water supply and their own garden, you're going to have the idea of needing to protect that now, but nonetheless, you're going to be safer off the bat, I would say. But that's exactly why the government is actively trying to stop this from happening. And we've done shows about this. We did one called How to Break Free of the System, and understanding that there are people that are just trying to live their lives completely disconnected from the system, yet they are still forced to pay for electricity to plug into the system they're not using, and even half the time to move back and away from the plot of land. They're being kicked off their land and forced to move back into cities. I mean, it's not a secret, you know?
So if there were, let's say you've got a family member who comes to you and says, I'm starting to get concerned. What are 3 things I should do?
Well, obviously, educate yourself. The very first thing you should ever do is learn how to do these things, and get material that you can take with you, some books and hard copy type of ideas where you can actually, a friend of both of ours from Full Spectrum Survival, he has a great thing where he sends out, I'm actually one of his Patreons, he sends out little hard copy cards with little detailed information on it. And stuff like that is paramount. But then after that, clearly just getting a fresh water source, a plot of land, those are things that I'm trying to accomplish right now. The idea where you have a self-sustaining property where you don't have to leave if you don't want to. I would say that is the utmost importance right now to get to that. But education is the very first thing everyone needs to do.
Well, Ryan, if people want to pick up more on, and I mentioned earlier that you were doing a significant amount of writing recently about the geopolitical clashes between nations and what it foretells for us, where can they find more of your work?
You can check us out on thelastamericanvagabond.com, as well as our YouTube channel of the same name. As well as our new radio station, WKUP, The Shift. We air all of our podcasts daily, as well as really insightful music from different artists. But that's any one of those, you can find out any of this content. And before we go, actually, I want to throw out an interesting tidbit that I just saw today with one of our articles we put up. That, interestingly enough, right now it's about 70% of Americans are unable to find North Korea on a map. Zero Hedge did a great article about this, and it shows, and they did research on this showing that the 30% that was able to actually locate North Korea were much more likely to want a peaceful solution, showing you once again that education is paramount, and that the people that are educated tend to be a little more understanding of the peaceful solutions. And that also shows you why the government is actively trying to dismantle our educational system, right? Stupid people are easier to corral.
A lot of the policies that we've seen over the last 5 decades or so have led to increasing dependence, loss of life skills, and more dependence on artificially power structures that they're sort of self-serving and self-sustaining. Absolutely. The hand that gives is above the hand that receives, and it's almost lost arts in most people, most households in the next generation of how to provide for themselves. So we'll like to have you back again when we can. Our time is limited tonight, but thank you again for joining us with these topics, and we'll have to have you back and talk about a little bit more of those sustaining topics. And I think what we'll do is try to get you on sometime with Brad Harris from Full Spectrum Survival, who created some of those survival tip cards that you mentioned as well, and talk about some of the practical applications. So Ryan Cristian, founder of The Last American Vagabond, thanks once again for joining us here in Reluctant Preppers.
That's always a pleasure, Donegan, and I look forward to the next show.